Thanks for joining us for another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. What we're going to be talking about today is the idea of authentic learning in a virtual setting. Now, although the focus is on the virtual setting, this is authentic learning that can be used in any classroom. I just will have some ideas and some strategies that can specifically be used for the virtual setting. But the ideas and the main philosophy behind this authentic learning can be applied to any classroom. So my name is Todd Stanley. I'm the gifted coordinator for Pickerington Local Schools. And so my information is there. I have my Twitter account, my website, and my email address. So if you would want to talk about this further or have further discussion about this, those are available for you to do that. So why do authentic learning in the first place? Well, first off, the Gallup poll did a study, and what they saw is that over time, student engagement drops precipitously. So when they're in elementary school, kids are like three out of every four kids are engaged in the learning. They want to be there. They're enjoying the learning. It's very engaging. And then by the time you get to high school, less than half of the kids are engaged in the learning. What this poll does not show is what I've observed in my own experiences is that when I go into elementary school or middle school, kids are doing engaging activities. They're doing a lot of authentic learning. They are not being passive in the learning process. They are involved in the learning process. And yet, when I walk into high schools, this isn't the case for all high school classes, but I do notice a lot of passive learning where the teachers are talking at students and students are sitting at their desks taking in information. And guess what? In a virtual setting, if you're sitting they're sitting at their desk and you're just talking at them, this is passive learning. And so if we want to engage students, especially in a virtual setting where it's very easy for them to be passive because they're not in your classroom, you can't physically, make them do labs or whatever. It's going to be really challenging to get engagement in the virtual classroom. So what are some things that you can do? So the first thing I want to do is stop talking at you. Get out from behind my computer. Put some pants on and be really animated and engaging with my students. Not so fast. This is not necessarily the way to do things. It's not about you being engaging. It's not about you being exciting. It's about engaging your students. Let me show you another example of something that's not necessarily authentic and is not going to engage your students, yet I see a lot of teachers doing this. So take, for instance, I'm teaching this social studies class. And so what you see here is I put the Coliseum behind me and I give my lecture that has them sitting and just listening the whole time. That background is not going to be authentic. It's not going to be engaging. If I'm in ELA class, I might put on this symbolism when I'm discussing The Great Gatsby. But if I'm still discussing content in The Great Gatsby instead of ideas, instead of ways to think about The Great Gatsby, then that's not going to be authentic. It's not going to be engaging. If I'm in science class and I put myself in front of this volcano and then proceed to tell them all the facts about volcanoes rather than looking at real life volcanoes, that's not very authentic. Or take this math example. Sorry, math people, there's not much. But the point is that in math especially, it's hard to find authentic visuals. It's tough to find authentic learning. But if you can put math in the real world, if you can make it connect to their real world, that's where the authentic learning takes place. And of course, when you get really desperate, you can just do this. The point being that when you do it this way, this is style over substance. You are just merely trying to entertain them rather than to engage them. And so one thing that you need to consider is how can you add substance to your authentic learning? How can you add substance to the engagement that students are doing rather than just trying to add style to it? So this visual right here is a good one to show how you can move towards authentic learning. So at the bottom, what you see there is the hierarchy of instructional skill development. So that is, what do the kids need to learn? What do they need to know? It starts at the very bottom, where you're just your typical classroom, and you're managing this classroom, and you're managing their resources. Eventually, this would go to learning centers, where students are maybe doing station rotations, or they're doing different activities depending upon their skills. Things are being differentiated. It goes up to project-based simulations, where students are doing project-based learning or other authentic strategies, which I'll talk about, and where they're actually doing things in the real world, whether it's a product or a problem, or the audience that they're presenting to. You're making this a real world connection. And so you are connecting to their world, and as a result, that's going to engage them because it's part of their world. And then that's when eventually, as you do that further and further and further, that's when you'll get to authentic learning. As the more that you grow in complexity, and the more that you take these skill sets and try to find ways to apply it to the real world. So there's a lot of content that you are going to teach as a teacher that your students ultimately will either forget or never have to use again the rest of their lives. That's the reality of teaching. It doesn't mean we shouldn't teach it. We have the content standards. We need to make sure we're teaching those. But in the grand scheme of things, a lot of times students are not going to be using this stuff later on. I know in my own life, I learned a lot in school that I never, ever had to use again. And so that wasn't as meaningful for me or engaging for me. But if I'm learning this content using skills that are going to allow me 21st century skills, that are going to allow me to transfer this to anything that I do. So whether it's research, or whether it's giving a presentation, or it's learning how to collaborate with someone, whether it's critical thinking or problem solving, this skill set of what I'm building on is going to help me no matter what content I'm covering, or no matter what I'm trying to learn. So this authentic learning in the classroom builds upon it. The more that you grow in complexity, the more that you culminate these skill sets, you'll eventually get to that point of authentic learning. And of course, there's refining and reviewing, which you see there at the top. Refining means that you constantly have to be reevaluating what you're doing in the classroom and making changes and adjusting. If you just keep doing the same thing over and over, so you just do this project-based learning the entire class, and it's the same every single time. They're learning the same skill every time. They're learning the same, working with the same people. That is not going to grow them into authentic learning. So you have to refine this and make changes, and review what it is that you're doing. So here are some examples of things you can do in the classroom. The first one is authentic assessment. So when students finish learning about something, how do you assess them? Oftentimes what happens is students write an essay. They're turning it into teacher grades it, gives it back. It maybe goes, at best case scenarios, it goes on the refrigerator. Worst case scenarios, it gets pitched. So that's not very authentic, where you're taking this, you're turning in, you're getting it back. It's not really seeing the real world other than your teacher. So there are ways that you can do authentic assessment. So instead, what if you had to have students write persuasive essays, have them write persuasive letters or emails to actual people where they're trying to elicit change. It could be to a congressman. It could be to a business that you're not happy with the way they're doing things. But this is a real live audience, and you're trying to persuade them. It could be using their knowledge of math to solve real world problems. It's important for students to see how math works in the real world. So when they go to the grocery store, they're using math all the time. They may not be aware of it at their age, but their parents are using math all the time to determine what it is that they're going to buy, how much of it they're going to buy, and so on and so forth. What is their budget? And so put them in situations where it's a real life situation. They're using that math. Maybe seeing shapes in buildings, maybe seeing things around their house that they can do that involves math, whether it's perimeter of the room that they're in, and how they can, what could they fit into this room if they got to design this room themselves. When they're doing science experiments, a lot of times we do this paint by number science experiment where we walk them through what they're supposed to be doing, and everyone has the same result. Wouldn't it be more interesting if you allowed them to create their own experiments and to create their own steps of the scientific method that they're going to use, and have them do that? And then each student is unique in what they're doing, and they're learning in their own unique way. and it's engaging as a result. When you're in history class, history is one of those things where kids ask all the time, why am I learning about this? This happened 1,000 years ago. Why should I care about this? This happened 10 years ago. Why should I care about this? This happened 2 days ago. Why should I care about it? You could do things to engage them or make it more authentic by having them debate historical topics in the shoes of the people that were involved in this. And so they can try to gain perspective on why this person felt that the way that they did. No matter what authentic assessment you choose, one choice is always to allow students to choose for themselves how they're going to be assessed. Allow them to come up with their own ideas. I never wanted to limit my students to my own imagination and my own creativity because I know it's limited as compared to theirs, which is far superior than mine. So why wouldn't I use their ideas? Why wouldn't I let them give them choice on what they're going to be assessed on? A lot of times, everyone is taking the exact same assessment. What if I gave students choices? Like a kid who's really good at speaking, but they're not so hot at writing and they're not motivated by writing, and yet they could explain something to you, but you're having them write what it is that they learned. What if you played into their strengths and have them speak it, whether making a Flipgrid video or something of that nature? So authentic assessment is one way that you can make your classroom more authentic. And this can be done in a virtual setting very easily by having them actually create products that will, that are real world in nature, where they're, it's something that they would, or using a skill while creating that product that's going to be transferable to the real world. Authentic audiences. So once they have these products, who are they presenting them to? There are some strategies that you can use in order to give them a more authentic feel. Simple thing is that you can invite parents on performance days, so that they're not just presenting to their fellow classmates. All of a sudden it's their parent or it's other adults and they can't really sound like they don't know what they're talking about. So they have to step it up a little bit as a result of that. Having experts act as a panel. So if they're presenting on a particular topic and you bring people in who are experts on that topic to evaluate them, again, they're going to have to really know their stuff. And this makes it authentic. And even the nervousness and the anxiety of presenting to this authentic audience is a real life skill that students need to learn. You can connect students with mentors to act as their audience. So in other words, if they're writing a paper, and you have them work with someone who knows about this topic or has written papers like this, and they mentor them along the way, that would be a good way for them to see how it works in the real world, because this person could say, well, this is how it manifests itself in my world and my job. So they're seeing the connection there. Have public displays of their work, whether it's a website or creating a YouTube video that goes out to everyone, where their audience is more widespread than just the four walls of your classroom or the confines of their basement or their room or wherever their virtual classroom is. Have them submit to works to contests or competitions. I love using national competitions to have them problem solve because it puts it in the real world. They're competing against others. They're having to put into play what it is that they learned, not just for the sake of the teacher or the class, but for a greater audience. Have them collaborate with students and classes from around the world. In this virtual setting, you have a really unique advantage here where that they're on their computer. And so they could be talking with someone from across the globe. This summer, I was teaching students from China who were 12 hours difference from me. And yet it was like they're in the next room. And so having them collaborate with students who are not from their culture or not from their immediate classmates could be a good way for them to have an authentic audience. And creating a professional learning network. So if you find a kid that has a really particular interest, could you connect them to a professional learning network for them to learn more about that? And so say a kid in science class really loves space. Could you hook them up with an organization that learns about space more in depth? They could join and be a part of that professional learning network. Another authentic thing that you can do in the classroom is actually authentic teaching. And there's a few things I'm going to give you suggestions for here. First off, staying away from the front of the classroom. I try not to talk at my students incessantly as I'm doing right this very minute, but I'm going to step away from this, don't worry. So But maybe not being in front of the class for so long. I mean, the attention span of students and adults alike, even if they want to learn what it is that they're hearing about, can be as little as 10 to 20 minutes. And so if you're spending more time than that on something, you're going to lose your audience. Avoid just giving them the information. What if the kids or the students found that instead? This is a matter of, instead of saying, here's all the information you need, saying, hey, here's the internet. Go find what you need to find. Find resources that you think are reliable. So don't just give them the information. Have them find the information. You should never be doing more work than your students. And so my philosophy was always, when students are the ones learning about this, not me. So how can I put them in places where they're doing the learning rather than me giving them information that they then learn and or memorize and regurgitate. Stop being the providing solutions when students have problems. If students have problems, give them the coping mechanisms to solve these themselves. What are ways that they can figure this out for themselves? That's going to be really important. I think first and foremost, we need to trust our students and give them more credit than we oftentimes give them, that they are very capable of learning. Kids love to learn, especially gifted kids. They love to learn. They just might not want to learn about what you're teaching them. They do have methods that they go about their learning. So tap into those methods and allow them to use them for the purposes of good rather than the purposes of evil. So what I'm going to talk about now is strategies. So big picture strategies that you can use in your virtual classroom or, again, in any classroom to help with the authentic nature of the learning. So this is the kind of the structure of the authentic learning, which is that you have inquiry learning is kind of at the top. It is informing everything else, and usually there is some collaboration going on with this learning. And then there are the three specific strategies of project-based learning, problem-based learning, and case-based learning. So inquiry-based learning is basically students ask a question or you pose a question, they investigate that on their own using resources that you either provide for them or that they find on their own, preferably. They create something that then shows what they learned or what they, what it is that they mastered by doing this. Then they discuss this, what they found, and then they reflect upon that. So that is the basic structure of inquiry-based learning. So if you can set up a 5-minute lesson using this structure. You could set up a 5-week lesson setting up this structure. So it can be applied to a lot of different situations. If you want more in-depth, detailed explanation of inquiry-based learning here is a YouTube video that I made that's a bit longer on inquiry-based learning. So if you want to do some investigation on your own, I want to give you the opportunity to be able to do that. The second one I want to talk about is problem-based learning. And problem-based learning looks different than traditional based learning because you assign a problem, or a problem is they come up with a problem, they identify what they need to know, and then they try to learn and apply to solve the problem. And you want to make this a real world problem, and this makes it definitely authentic. And so this is different than the traditional method, which you see at the top there, which is typically students are told what they need to know, they memorize it, and then they just apply it to a problem, or they regurgitate it back in an assessment. So that's not really authentic necessarily. And so we want to make it more authentic. And problem-based learning is a great way to do that, to find problems that are going on in the real world and having students try to solve those. And the best case scenarios for those are the unsolvable problems. So if you ask students to solve world hunger, that can't be solved, but boy, it would be very interesting to come up with solutions for what that might look like. And so that's going to be really authentic, and it's going to be something that's, close to their own, to home, and that there is starvation and hunger going on in the world, that making them aware of that and what they can do to help with that. If you want a more in-depth discussion on what problem-based learning is, you can go to this YouTube video, which is right here. Again, for you, an opportunity for you to investigate a little bit further. Project-based learning basically has lots of elements to it, but you as the teacher or the students themselves come up with a challenging problem or a question, and then they use this inquiry to kind of, in their own voice and their choice, to create a product of some sort. And this product then is going to show mastery of what it is that they learn, this public product, which you see at the top there. And there's reflection that goes on during this and critiquing and revision. But basically, the major difference between problem-based learning and project-based learning is problem-based learning is about the process, what you're learning along the way. And in project-based learning, a lot of times it is what they produce at the end, what they've learned there. Now, there is some overlap there. So if you want to know about how to set up project-based learning in your classroom, you can go watch this YouTube video, which I've created, that will allow you to get more information on how you might specifically and personally create project-based learning in your own classroom. The last one I want to talk about is one that's not as well known. It's called case-based learning. And it has echoes of the other two that we've talked about. And so case-based learning basically is students are given a real-life case, something that happened in the past. So it could be looking at, an event that happened and how things were handled, or a court case, or it could be looking at a science experiment gone wrong or gone right, and so on and so forth. So they're given this factual information, and then they look it over as a group. They brainstorm ideas on how they would go about solving this problem or this case. They create their own learning objectives. So what are we going to learn? They take the research, they sort it out, and they present what they came up with. And this is usually to an authentic audience. And then, of course, they reflect upon what they could have done better and what they could do better in future cases. So case-based learning is mostly used amongst the medical field and law field. Doctors look at old cases to try to learn. Lawyers do the same thing. They look at precedents that have been set and how they can, use that to further their own case that they're currently working on. So if you want to know more about that, here is a YouTube video that you could go to find out more about that. One thing I do want to touch on is the idea of how do you manage this authentic classroom, especially in a virtual setting. First off, is you want to manage stress. It can be very stressful, the not knowing, the not having connections necessarily on a day-to-day personal basis. And so I always am a big fan of having the cameras on. I know some people make arguments that they should not be on or necessarily be on because students might be embarrassed of their home life. But I like to see faces. So if you can ask students to put themselves in a place that would not, be embarrassing to show their face, then I recommend that they do that. And that way you can see the body language that students are using, because this will oftentimes indicate their stress levels, whether they're frustrated or have anxiety or things are just going great. The second thing is that you need to provide students space. So like I gave you 5 minutes in this particular presentation to go think about some questions. I'm going to give you another 10 minutes here in a moment to explore some things, but I'm going to give you space, and you should do the same for your students. You don't have to be in front of the camera all the time. You could say, take the next hour and do this, and give them, a task to accomplish, but give them the space to do that in your virtual setting. Keeping them focused on the goals of the lesson. Inquiry-based learning, the tough thing about that is that students get so caught up sometimes in either the product or the process or something that they're doing that they lose sight of what it is that they're supposed to be learning. And so as the teacher, making that visible learning, as John Hattie talks about, and making it clear to students what it is that they're going to be learning, and what the learning objectives are, or if they come up with their own learning objectives, just referring them to that all the time. When students, I think collaboration is really important. So it is important to collaborate, to conference with students, either individually or in groups, and this is just to check in with students. And this is, again, making that connection. So you could, if you have Zoom, you could do a breakout room and have conversations with individual groups. If you're in a Google Meet, you could have office hours or appointments where students come in at certain times to the Google Meet, and you're having a conversation with them. And you can check on the status of it. You could have them reflect upon what they're doing. You can look at where their product is. So there's lots of things you can talk about at this conference, but you're having that conversation with students and making that connection with them. The last thing is, if you are going to ask students to collaborate, it's very important that you train them on doing this, especially in a virtual setting, which might look a little bit different. So what you could do is when you put them in breakout rooms, I often will pop into those breakout rooms to give them some, if they're stuck on something, or to provide them with some uh, a way for them to collaborate together if they're having difficulty with that. But if I've done my job, I would have done this before. I would have talked about what it means to collaborate and what the expectations are. So you do have to train students on what collaboration looks like and how they might do that so that they can properly do that. What I just showed you were kind of overarching large concept strategies that you can use in the classroom. But I want to give you something tangible that you can use to go back to your classroom almost immediately and be able to put some of these strategies into play. So if you would like to learn more about these specific strategies that you can implement in the classroom almost immediately, what you can do is you can go to my website, which is thegiftedguy.com. And then under the banner here, under professional development, if you click on that, it will bring you to a bunch of different resources for professional development. And one of the things in here is these authentic learning strategies. So if you want to learn more about them, you can click on them. Like for this one, this will take you to an article on guest speakers and make a compelling argument for why you should use guest speakers and how to go about doing that. If you go to this like virtual field trips one, it will give you all sorts of resources for different virtual field trips that students can take. So for instance, if you click on this, it will take you to a virtual field trip at the American History Museum. And so, or you could click on this as a video. So that's just there for you to explore further. I didn't want to go into great detail with them, but if you find one that you think that really speaks to you or you think might really work well in your virtual classroom, you can click on any one of these to get a further understanding of how they work. So I want to leave you with a few parting pieces of advice. The first one is the 5 things to avoid in the virtual classroom. And too much content is the number one thing. So I see this time and time again where teachers put so much content on the LMS that they're using, the learning management system, that the students simply just become overwhelmed. And it's content that the students might have been able to find on their own and learn a valuable skill in the process. So just be wary of how much content, whether it's actual screen time or it's actual volume of content, and give your students a little bit of credit that they can find content on their own and find maybe and sometimes content that might be better. The second thing, avoid passiveness. So as much as possible, try to switch things up. In this particular seminar, this particular lecture, I tried to change things up. So there was some live, there was some me talking at you. There were some times where you were up and moving around. There were other times you were exploring. So I tried to not go for more than 10, 15 minutes of you having to listen at one point. And after that 15 minutes, I would switch gears into something else to try to make sure that you are not being too passive. So passiveness, you want to avoid that. Students just sitting listening to you is not going to be an authentic way of learning. Avoid the one size fits all. A lot of times we give assignments and we have the same questions, the same assessments, the same whatever for all kids. Keep in mind that these, especially your gifted kids, are going to need certain strategies that maybe your regular ed kids are not. And so keep in mind that you need to fit the learning opportunity with the student themselves. So the more you get to know them, the more you'll know how to challenge them, and the more that you can differentiate and offer them things that are specific to their own skills and learning needs. So keep that in mind, that you don't do a one size fits all. Not every kid should be doing the exact same assignment the exact same way. Know this, that boring crap in the classroom is equally, if not more boring in a virtual setting. So if you give a kid a worksheet in the classroom, and then you give them one in the virtual classroom as well, it is equally as boring, if not more. So keep that in mind, that you want to avoid boring teaching strategies. And I don't mean by you have to have exciting ones, but what we talked about, and authenticity and engagement, and making sure that kids are connected. And then lastly, the focus on compliance is just maddening for me, and that we're so worried about kids being there, or kids, making sure that their ducks are in a line, that they're following the rules, that they're following the steps. that we're not giving kids much space to do learning on their own, learning for learning's sake. And so I think if you show kids, here's the thing about compliance that I have learned. If you engage the kid, the compliance takes care of itself. If you engage them, they'll want to be in your classroom. If you engage them, they'll want to be on task. If you engage them with an authentic task, then they're going to want to be involved. And so keep that in mind, that if you engage them in authentic learning opportunities, the compliance simply just takes care of itself. 5 things that you can do in your classroom to make it authentic to think about is provide a lot of student choice. So whether it becomes on assessments or on topics or whatever, give students choice. You can use menu boards. You can use all sorts of strategies to give students more choice and more voice in what it is that they're doing. Secondly is allow for collaboration. In a virtual setting, it's easy to not do collaboration because kids are in their own houses, but you can certainly find ways to do that, whether it be setting up a breakout room or having them call one another or having them open a Google Doc or Google Slides and share it with one another and then collaborate together. But you want to give students the opportunity to collaborate with one another because although we're in a virtual setting, we still need to be connected to people. We still need to be involved. We still need to have that element of working with others. As much as possible, when you are teaching skills and learning, focus on 21st century skills. I mentioned some before, such as problem solving and critical thinking, but other ones could be literacy, making sure that you are able to pull what you need out by reading content. It could be doing a presentation. It could be, things such as using creativity. All these are 21st century skills that kids are going to transcend the classroom. And if kids can do it in their classroom, they can do it in the real world. And so it's going to have a major effect and impact on them. Challenge their thinking as much as possible. So ask higher level questions. Worksheets are not necessarily bad if you're asking the right questions on them. When you're asking lower level content or content questions, that is a bad worksheet. But when you're asking them thought-provoking questions to think about, that is not a bad worksheet. That's thought-provoking and getting them engaged in what it is you're doing. Lastly, make sure that you have you're making connections. You're making it metacognitive. And what I mean by metacognitive is the student wants to know what it has to do with me. What does it have to do with me? Why should I care about this? Why does this matter? So you need to make that link to their own personal lives so that they can see the metacognitive connection. It also means making connections with your students by having conversations with them. So the conferences I talked about before, or having morning meetings or things of that nature, but making efforts to make connections with your students, even though you're speaking from one computer to another.